Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm an artist, and today I wanted to talk about what supplies you actually need to get started with painting. Now, there are a lot of supplies that you could get that would be totally fun to use. They might help your creativity unlock, they might be super exciting things to use, but they're not necessary to start painting. So, this list is going to be very basic. These are the bare minimum. This is the simplest things you need to start with painting. Okay, so the first thing that you need is a painting palette. Now, I'm talking about painting for this because painting is a little bit more complex than drawing. It's easy to go get a drawing kit and a piece of paper and get started with drawing. For painting, it's a little bit more complicated and it's a little bit more confusing sometimes about what do you actually need to start painting. So the first thing you need is a painting palette. And I'm for each of these things that in this list that I give you, I'm going to talk about a cheap option and a more expensive option. And really your decision on the specific product or the specific material to get started painting that you need will depend on your goals. If you want to start painting to create beautiful fine art wall hangings as gifts or either to sell, you're going to want higher quality materials. You're going to want more expensive stuff. Probably from an art supply store, not just something from Hobby Lobby or Walmart. If, however, you're just trying to practice your creativity, you want to grow your hobby and your artistic skills a little bit, but really casually and without much pressure, it's okay to go with cheaper products. That's totally fine. It's really your goal that's going to help determine this. So for the painting palette, on the cheaper side, you could use a paper plate or an old plate in your house. I would say if you use a paper plate, you're going to want to replace it after each painting session. Don't reuse it because when water gets on the paper plate, which most painting medias, you use water with them, or most that I will talk about today. And whenever water gets on paper plates, the paper plate starts to kind of break apart a little bit, and those plate pieces can get into your paint and then onto your canvas, and it looks really junky. So just to keep the integrity of your artwork, I would suggest swap out with a new paper plate every painting session if you can. But you could also use a regular plate, one that you don't really care about or you were going to get rid of or you found at a thrift store or something. You could totally do that. Now, on the more expensive side, I suggest a glass painting palette. Now, I like these. I bought one off of Amazon for not very expensive, but definitely more expensive than a paper plate. And I love it because I can scrape off my leftover paint and start again. I don't have to get a new one every time I want to paint. I don't have to throw it away. Once the whole thing's covered with paint, there is not a point where there's too much paint on it to use anymore. You just scrape it off and start again. And I really love that function. It's very durable and long lasting. So if you're really going to invest in your artwork or you just don't want to have to worry about swapping plates, I really suggest the glass painting palettes. I personally am still using my Amazon one. I would like to get a bigger one eventually, but right now I'm still using a simple small Amazon one and it works great for me. So, first thing you need, painting palette. The second thing you need, this is probably going to be your hardest decision. Maybe it won't be, but for me it was a hard decision. What media do you want to go with? So there's kind of four painting medias that I know of, at least, and that I'm going to talk about today. The first three I highly recommend, more so than the last one. I love all four, but there is one that's a little easier to get started with if you're first time ever getting into painting. If you're a little bit more confident with painting and you have a little bit more money to invest, I would recommend the others. But the four are oil paint, acrylic, gouache, and watercolors. Watercolors is often a go-to, but I would recommend gouache as the media of choice if you are starting out first ever as a painter. If you're just getting into it for the first time, it's kind of the best of both worlds. It is a little bit more opaque like acrylics, but it's also water based as watercolors is. So it's a kind of an in between those two medias. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, if you will. Your media that you choose is going to determine what materials you're going to need. I'm not going to talk about oil painting much today because that one is a lot more expensive to get started, and that one, to get certain effects and have full versatility of your media, you really do need mediums that you can mix with your media to create the effect on your canvas. So that one, I love oil painting, but it is a lot more costly and more difficult to get started in. So I would recommend watercolor, gouache especially. Acrylic would also be fun. So the media you choose is going to be important. And again, in the same way that it kind of varies in difficulty here, like I talked about, it also varies in price. So watercolors is probably the cheapest paint you can get. You can get a pan palette, a pan of watercolor paints. You can get the little tubes, and not for very much. You can get it for the cheapest that you can spend on art paint. The gouache is probably the second. It's a little bit more expensive than watercolors, but it's still not very expensive. You can get it at Hobby Lobby. You can order it online. It's very accessible. Acrylics are a little pricier than those two, but still a lot cheaper than oil paints. Oil paints are by far much more expensive just to buy one tube of paint. So keep that in mind. If price is something you are thinking about, your media is really going to affect how much everything costs. So you need a palette, you need paint. The third thing you need are paintbrushes. Paintbrushes are a little tricky, I think, because some of it comes down to personal preference, and you won't know your personal preference until you try different paintbrushes. So I, just like the other things, if you are wanting to be really serious about your art and you want to make big fine art paintings, I really suggest you invest more money into high quality paintbrushes, like from a art supply store. If, however, you're keeping it super casual and a little bit more crafty and you're just practicing creativity, it's totally fine to use cheap Walmart paintbrushes. It really needs to match your goals. But I would advise you to consider different shapes of your paintbrush, because different shapes of paintbrushes can give you different effects, different textures on your canvas. They can feel different, and it's helpful to have all of a lot of to a lot to choose from so that you have a lot of tools in your tool bag. So for example, this is a round brush. Okay, obviously I don't really like to use the fancy names for paintbrushes because it makes it a little more like you have to memorize the definition before you can use the word and everything. So to me, this is a flat, squarish brush, and we have a round brush, all right? So this is just two examples. There's a lot of others. There's round ones. There's rough, bristled ones. I suggest get a couple of them. You can always build a paintbrush collection. You don't have to start off with 20 paintbrushes. You could start off with 3. But don't get 3 of the same kind. Get 3 different kinds and see what you like. Again, your brush choices need to reflect your goals with your painting. That's the third thing. The fourth thing is you need a surface to paint on. Now, depending on which media you chose, it's going to impact what surface you choose to paint on. If you choose acrylics, you're probably going to want to use a canvas or a canvas panel. I find you can get canvases at Hobby Lobby for not too expensive. Canvas panels as well, they're a little cheaper than canvases, I think. You can't necessarily, it's not as easy to paint with acrylic paint on watercolor paper, but you can. I have done so. I don't think I have any examples behind me. I may have used a little bit of acrylic paint here on these flowers, but I may have used, yeah, no, I did. This was acrylic paint that I did for the flowers on that painting. So you can do acrylics on watercolor paper if you want, but it is not the easiest thing. Your paper often kind of wrinkles a little bit, or if you overwork it or you put too much water with your acrylic paint, your paper can start disintegrating like the paper plate palette we talked about earlier. So you just want to be careful about that. For acrylic, I would typically recommend canvas panel or canvas. For gouache, you can do gouache on almost anything. I have yet to try it on a canvas. I've done it on watercolor paper so far, but I do want to try it on canvas soon. I don't see why it wouldn't work. So I typically do gouache on watercolor paper, and watercolors is typically on watercolor paper as well. So yeah, that's the cheapest, probably. The cheapest surface you can use to paint on is watercolor paper. And again, with watercolor paper, you need to pick one that fits your goals. Depends how much money, how much time, how serious do you want to be about this. And it's totally fine if you want this to not be very serious. It's totally fine to want to learn to paint just for the fun of it, just to occasionally have a hobby and paint something cute every once in a while. That's totally fine. So don't ever hear pressure from me about, oh, you need all these expensive things. You can do it cheaper, and that's totally fine. We just wanted to make sure what you're choosing is intentional to help you meet your goals, okay? So that's the fourth thing you need, is a surface to paint on. The fifth thing you need is water. All of these paints, except for oil paint, which we're not really talking about, but the other three all need water to use them. Watercolors obviously needs water. It's water activated. Gouache is also water activated. You can, both of those, if you squirt them from the tube, you can use them straight from the tube without water, but water is the tool for that. So a media is your type of paint, okay? And a medium is something you add to your media to get a new effect. So water is the medium of watercolors, or water is the medium of gouache paints. Whereas there's other things like this that can be mediums for acrylic paint, or there's others that you can use for oil painting as well, which I can talk about in the future if you are interested. But yes, you need water if you're going to paint with these acrylic, watercolor, gouache options. I also suggest a spray bottle if you have a pan watercolor set and it's not in the tubes. Also, for gouache, you can reactivate it if it's on your palette and it dries. So having a spray water bottle just to get it a little bit activated so you can paint again is super helpful. Okay, so those are the 5 things that you need if you're going to get started with painting. There's a lot of fun other things I would love to talk about and share about, and some of them I have talked about in the video talking about art supplies that's on my channel. You can check it out. But the bare minimum, this is what you actually need: a palette, your paint, paintbrushes, your surface, and water. So let me know in the comments, what is your goals with painting? Have a good day. Bye.